Genuinely, every imaginable siren is happening right now, outside. And there is a plane overhead. I think that was a mallard. There is no genre of film or fiction that has captured the language of dreams more than 80s dark fantasy. Mention of the genre immediately conjures visions of purple sparkles, moonbeams, castle turrets shrouded in mist, of shapeless evils hiding in dark forests, of bizarre, furry, and feathered creatures communicating in human language. The stories themselves often defy logic, yet they bring on emotions that couldn't feel more real. I adore the 80s dark fantasy genre and rather like dreams, or perhaps more accurately, nightmares. The films of the era have a way of haunting those who've seen them. Labyrinth, Legend, Neverending Story, Dark Crystal, Return to Oz, these have a hold over people, both the generations raised on them and those discovering them today. It's easy to dismiss our collective love of the genre as intangible nostalgia, but I wouldn't have a channel if I simply called it all intangible and moved on. So, for those of us who remain haunted, why is it that dark fantasy feels so right and equally so wrong? It's worth starting with what the fantasy genre actually pertains to. Fantasy stories are those that take place in worlds unlike our own. It's broad to say the least, but I feel the crucial element tying together the genre is the presence of magic or otherworldly forces beyond human reality. And this is what sets fantasy apart from sci-fi or historical fiction. Historical fantasy, most often inspired by the Middle Ages, is incredibly popular, playing on real-world socio-political structures. The medieval influence is clear in major high fantasy properties like Game of Thrones, and undoubtedly there in many of the films from the 80s boom in the costumes, character archetypes, and dialogue. The medieval period's impact is apparent in pretty much all of them, but not quite all. Magical worlds have an immeasurable number of potential settings and tones beyond that of medieval history. Wizard of Oz is certainly fantasy, witches and fairies included, though its alternate world doesn't have the aesthetic qualities of 1600s Europe. Secret of Nim has fantastical elements, like Nicodemus's amulet, but it's set in rural America in the 1980s. The Neverending Story and its sequel's aesthetic is so varied and unique, it's hard to describe it at all other than as prime 80s dark fantasy. All that said, within this vast 80s dark fantasy landscape, we get everything from knights and dragons to head-swapping villains and the devil, all tinged with that signature 80s oddness. But let's knuckle down to some of the specific qualities that make it so captivating. I present to you 5 chapters: familiarity, shamelessness, practical effects, dark themes, and commercial freedom. Before we carry on with the video, I have a very exciting announcement to make. That being, after much contemplation and deliberation, I have decided to start a Patreon. It's something I've ummed and ahed about for a really long time, but unfortunately a couple of months ago, I had to stop doing YouTube as full-time work as I had a big drop in views, and that meant that I was not receiving a full-time income from it anymore. And while I am now working a normal job as well as YouTube, which means there is no pressure for anybody to support me, I did want to give people the opportunity to contribute to what I do if they want to. So I'll put the information for each tier on screen, and if you sign up at any tier, you'll get a bonus Men Riding Women Paul Verhoeven video to enjoy. Ultimately, nothing is going to change here on my channel. I'm so grateful to have the incredible audience that I do have, but if for some reason you would like to see more of me, or if you would like to make a financial contribution to my work, Patreon is the place to do it, so I will be linking that in the description below. I look forward to seeing you there, and well, I better get back to work. Apologies to anyone who usually enjoys my costume changes, but I do not want to take this off. Because how good is it? We'll start at the very beginning with the nature of the stories themselves. Films of this ilk tend to have easy to follow story structures that have been made familiar to us through centuries of storytelling. A common one that pops up is the hero's journey, which sets up a wholesome protagonist on a mission or a series of clearly set tasks. The story is chronological, the moral parameters are clear, and who we're meant to like is easy to decipher, depending on who supports or defies our hero. Within this, we sometimes have love stories, Wesley and Buttercup being the prime example. Although it's worth saying that romance doesn't actually pop up that much here. There are a few love stories that are lightly touched upon, like in Black Cauldron and The Dark Crystal, but for the most part, these films, many aimed at children, focus on the discovery of the self. The self-discovery narrative tends to take two shapes. Tales of encouragement that say, be yourself, be brave, be kind, and cautionary tales, warning of the world's perils, not to be naive, trusting, or foolish. Riddles, prophecies, and myths that exist within the fantasy world are another element that plays a major part in fleshing them out, and they give the audience more to interact with. When Sarah is quizzed on which door to open using a cunning riddle, we're trying to figure it out too. When the evil ruler Queen Bavmorda is alerted to a prophecy that would see a baby with a particular birthmark cause her downfall, we have an investment in seeing that come to light. And many of these films are based on real-world folktales and mythologies. Excalibur retells the legend of King Arthur's sword, which has been floating around since 1136 AD, when it was penned by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his History of Britain's Kings. The Company of Wolves takes direct inspo from Little Red Riding Hood, a folktale with an oral history as old as time. We have always had tales of good defeating evil, man fighting beast. We know how they go. Characters grow and learn and overcome dangers, and they make us feel like we can too. It's understandable and engaging for all ages, playing to our inner childlike sense of joy and morality and fear, our most basic human instincts. And these familiar, uncomplicated story structures give us the breathing room to enjoy everything else this crazy genre has to offer. One of the most notable trends of 70s cinema was realism. The Godfather, Taxi Driver, The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Jaws, Alien, Apocalypse Now, despite being blockbusters telling action-packed tales, they all brought a sense of gritty, real-world naturalism. But the popularity of extravagant space opera Star Wars, which came at the end of the decade in 1977, was the first major cracking of this mold in blockbuster cinema. Star Wars was a massive hit, and it allowed fantasy to boom. Oh my god, sorry, that was so loud. This gave us an abundance of fantasy in the 1980s and meant that money was being faithfully poured into the genre. With lots of room to move and play in the fantasy space, filmmakers were able to take risks and make strange choices. Labyrinth was a musical featuring a major pop star. Dark Crystal was a live-action film that didn't feature a single human person. They were making bold, creative decisions that would probably be argued out by a boardroom today. The fantastical aesthetic is obviously a huge part of the genre's appeal. It's so unique and was like nothing that had been realized in cinema before, thanks to bigger budgets, color film, and evolving special effects. These accumulated in the distinct look that nowadays feels like pure, uncorked nostalgia. Many of the films come across as campy and over the top in our current cinematic landscape, which also favors realism, but there was a logic backing the style. Everything had to be big. You can't have small performances take place on a huge, visually dominant stage. You can't have forgettable low-budget costumes when attempting to portray grand otherworldly stories. The filmmaking choices had to live up to the scale of fantasy itself. I obviously didn't live through this myself, on account of being 14, but it's no secret that fantasy was breaking into mainstream spaces in real life beyond just the cinema. Arcades with fantasy games were abundant, and Dungeons and Dragons, despite being a dorky pastime, developed mammoth popularity. As a side note, I wonder if the love of fantasy at this time had anything to do with the general Western optimism brought about by economic growth. I don't have nearly enough info to back that up, but I think there's an interesting idea linking joy-seeking and excess with the eagerness for fantasy fiction. And I know that it wasn't Wall Street ballers who were reading The Blue Sword, but maybe there's something in there. Thanks to a public eagerness for the genre, 80s fantasy films were proud to be fantasy and weren't trying to be anything else. They were earnest in a way that so few films today are afraid to be. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, they were earnest in a way that so few films today are brave enough to be. In the 2020s, films want to make sure that they are in on the joke in advance in case they become a laughingstock. I've talked about it before, others have talked about it before, but the presence of irony media is such a fucking boner killer. Films shouldn't need to eye roll at themselves in order to embrace whimsy and sincerity. Despite the childish, goofy stuff and the things that can be read now as camp or crude, the films took themselves seriously, creating a beautiful symbiotic relationship which allowed audiences to bask in them unabashedly. Probably my personal favourite aspect of 80s dark fantasy is the presence of practical effects, and specifically puppetry. Because, say it with me kids, everybody loves puppets. Digital special effects and CGI are so dominant nowadays, and I don't think many people deny that it doesn't have the same charm. For the most part, even in the most impressive high-budget projects, I see more complaints about poor special effects than I do praise. 80s movie creature design is directly impacted by the need for everything to be physically made. It can mean some of the characters share similar qualities like felt skin and ping pong eyeballs, but this limitation is far from a negative. I mean, look at these incredible creatures in their tactile beauty. Return to Oz gave us the nightmare fuel of the Wheelers skeeting around on all fours, bodies a tangle of wires. The Company of Wolves features many terrifying transformations from man to wolf, realized by way of animatronics. Neverending Story gave us the giant winking falcor, a creature we all dreamed of flying through the night with, buried in his fur. I originally described that as being buried in his soft, warm back, and something about actually saying that out loud made me feel deeply uncomfortable. And puppeteering is such an underrated profession, in my personal opinion. And if you want to see modern puppeteering in action, I highly recommend you check out the musical Avenue Q. You will see puppets doing things you never dreamed of, and will never be able to scrub from your mind. For so many of the iconic creatures of the 80s, we have Jim Henson to thank. Jim Henson was already known for his work on Sesame Street and The Muppet Show, but was introduced into the world of blockbuster cinema when he and his team at the Jim Henson Company were brought on board to do effects work for Star Wars. He's partially responsible, along with the makeup artist Stuart Freeborn, for the creation of Yoda, and brought in his longtime collaborator and fellow filmmaker Frank Oz to voice him. From here onwards, Henson and company dominated 80s fantasy, bringing us The Dark Crystal, which he co-directed with Oz, monumental for its many life-size puppets and sets, with some puppets taking 4 people to maneuver, alongside cult hit Labyrinth and its many recognizable characters like Hoggle, Ludo, and the Goblins. And as the decade came to a close, Henson created the somewhat lesser-known series The Storyteller as part of his show The Jim Henson Hour, which featured many more fantastical creatures. While some people might associate Henson more so with the brightly coloured family-friendly Muppets, his fantasy creatures have a distinctly haunting appearance. reflecting the morbid and frightening worlds they exist in. Drab colours, wrinkled skins, unsettling animalistic features, all dirtied and weathered. Of course, some of our love for this stuff is bound to be nostalgia, and it won't hit the spot for everyone, but for those drinking the Kool-Aid, why do puppets and practical effects work so well on screen even to this day? Actors actually got to interact with them on set and create real relationships. No tennis balls, no men in green morph suits. Their fur and hair moved organically in wind machines and water. They interacted with on-set lighting in a way no CGI to this day, bar maybe Avatar, has been able to flawlessly recreate. The rudimentary effects also have an uncanny quality that actually adds to their appeal. Fixed, motionless faces are frightening because they hold only one expression and there is nothing to read or intuit. It brings about the same subconscious discomfort we have with masks. That behind the frozen face there is something hiding, the wearer's true emotions unknown. And puppets don't make characters feel any less believable, even at their silliest and strangest, because we already have a suspension of disbelief when watching fantasy. It reads better than the CGI lines of The Lion King, despite the amazing technological developments, because they are aiming for hyperrealism, creating characters and worlds that are distinctly unlike our own, avoids the uncanny valley territory of being almost real or almost human. Instead, we can delight in the whimsical nature of an unreal thing moving through the world as if it were real. And the final win for the magic of puppets specifically is the inherently unsettling juxtaposition of their supposedly kid-friendly nature with the dark themes of 80s fantasy. Which brings us to our next chapter. Anyone who grew up on these films will tell you they are notoriously dark. It's in the name. 80s dark fantasy films are flooded with eerie imagery and have a generally dark aesthetic. Dark colours, eyes glowing in the mist, muddy swamps, skulls and skeletons, shadowy forests, ghouls and ghosts gripping at our beloved protagonists. Nightmarish visuals that are strongly associated with death, the occult and witchcraft. At times, they almost feel like horror movies. The draining of the podling's life force in Dark Crystal could almost be mistaken for A Clockwork Orange. The titular Watcher in the Woods is comparable to alien xenomorphs. Return to Oz has moments that feel as gleefully twisted as an Elm Street film. And it's in the action, not only the aesthetics. Kids are kidnapped, people are killed. Hell, Dorothy gets strapped to a psych ward chair like it's One Flew Over the F***ing Cuckoo's Nest. This isn't light stuff. Many of the films grapple with real-world themes. Dark Crystal centers around abuse of power and the exploitation of other races and classes, with the Skeksis as dictators ruling over the other creatures. Princess Bride, Dragon Slayer, and Willow all feature evil monarchs, communicating that power so often corrupts those it's afforded to. The Last Unicorn displays animal abuse. Don Bluth's The Secret of NIMH is, spoilers ahead, literally about animal testing at a mental health facility. I know I'm talking about how intense all of this is, but I cannot tell you how much I laughed when I found out that NIMH stood for National Institute of Mental Health. I saw this at a movie night with my friend Posey, and we were so baffled by it, given the context of the rest of the film. It's such a fucking weird decision. That's what makes it so wonderful. Some of the great evils, however, reflect our internal struggles with the human condition. Never-ending stories, the nothing, a pervasive emptiness infecting Fantasia can easily be seen as an allegory for depression or the crushing reality and hopelessness of adulthood. It's an abject terror, unfamiliar to the young Bastian and young viewers, made understandable by its fantasy form. The last unicorn of The Last Unicorn contemplates mortality and regret as she is trapped in an immortal body and separated from her human loved one. She says, "I have been mortal and some part of me is mortal yet. I am full of tears and hunger and the fear of death, although I cannot weep and I want nothing and I cannot die." Who put this in a children's film? You sick freak. I think a lot of people feel connected to these films because many have leads who are lost, lonely, or mistreated. Bastian especially, who retreats to Fantasia from a reality where he is bullied and friendless, resonated with many queer people who dealt with early ostracization, and in that they found the same solace that he did in these strange other worlds. I just want to shout out the Once Upon a VHS podcast here, as this queer relatability is something that they often touch on in discussing fantasy media. I could not recommend this podcast enough if you're a fan of film, fantasy, or 80s and 90s nostalgia. I discovered it about a year ago, and it brings me endless entertainment. Callum and Michael are so intelligent and hilarious, and I totally credit them in reigniting my own love for the 80s fantasy genre. There are also ideas in several of these films that are arguably down to interpretation, like assault and predatory relationships. You'll know if you've seen my Labyrinth video that I feel pretty passionate about this topic, but Henson's Labyrinth is overflowing with sexual imagery like David Bowie's bulge, the groping hand, and the phallic masks worn at the ball. Labyrinth and The Company of Wolves both feature older male characters enticing young women, or as they are otherwise known, children, with romantic or sensual gestures. Especially in Wolves, the predatory nature of the seduction isn't subtle. Sarah Patterson was only 13 when she played this role, and it makes these scenes deeply uncomfortable to watch, disturbing even. These films are highly appealing to children for their dreamy aesthetics, Muppet-adjacent creatures, and easy-to-understand hero and villain stories, but they also expose them to death, betrayal, and oppression, leading them through emotional journeys of loss and grief and transformation, all of these really adult ideas. In a sense, 80s dark fantasy films operated as a Trojan horse of sorts, funneling the pains of adulthood to a generation of children. Sorry to bring up horses. Sadly, a lack of major critical and commercial success across the board meant that by the end of the decade, these films were out of vogue. And in the years since, major studios have come to treat films as business ventures rather than art pieces. The world presented to us on screen must be commodifiable, purchasable, with just the right amount of wide-eyed animal sidekicks and goofy, relatable leading ladies. It's about the product, the toys, the app, the money, and it's incredibly noticeable in every modern Disney property, including the Star Wars series, that they are working backwards to create films and shows from their planned commercial enterprises. But during the decade itself, when films were free from this burden, they could be as strange and off-putting as they liked, because Don Bluth wasn't trying to sell you a Nicodemus plushie. When Black Cauldron and Return to Oz flopped, it pretty much put Disney off the dark kids film thing for the rest of time. Lucasfilm, now owned by Disney, did make a Willow TV series in 2022, but it supposedly had the lowest viewing figures of any Disney Plus show ever, and it was subsequently removed from streaming. Netflix's The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance was also sadly cancelled after a season, so it seems the big players are done with investing in fantasy projects for now. And it's just so sad because the yearning for fantasy from the people is still there. Look at the popularity of ACOTAR and other fantasy novels right now. I know that's partially because of the smut, but it's still the fantasy smut that's really popping off. I don't think I've said popping off in a very long time. That felt incredibly unnatural. Instagram and TikTok are flooded with AI edits that either reinterpret existing IP or place beloved celebrities in the 80s fantasy aesthetic. Fuck AI, obviously, but the comments are full of people fawning over them. People want to see this stuff. I'm interested to see what the response will be to 100 Nights of Hero, directed by Julia Jackman and starring Charlie XCX, as it looks to echo the 80s dark fantasy genre, and perhaps it will invigorate studio interest in fantasy if it has decent commercial success. But even so, it's unlikely that fantasy filmmakers will enjoy the unbridled creative freedom they had in the 80s. Like a candle in the castle after dark, thou hath been snuffed out. So, what to draw from all of this? Much of the beloved fantasy from the era is told in the language of dreams. Nonsensical narratives that lack logic and surreal imagery grounded in familiar feelings, grounded in our fears, our subconscious desires. We all have an innate draw to the fantastical, as we all have dreams and visions. Here we finally saw them taking place. Some are dark and haunting, burning imagery into our minds for the rest of our lives, but others are hopeful, reminding us that pure hearts and hope can triumph over the greatest evils. And some are bombastic, campy, and unsophisticated. But everything these films do, they do with such earnest. They believe in their own magic and ask you to believe in it too, for all of its wonder and despair. And that's what makes 80s dark fantasy feel so right and so wrong. Oh!